Thank you. It's really lovely for me to be here tonight. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm kind of very proud to be speaking alongside so many, like, the other speakers you have in this programme are really great as well. So, yeah, it's really lovely. The talk is called, Sahal, could you give me a wave at half an hour?
Sure.
Thank you. The talk is called The DAO, which stands, in this case, for the Decentralised Autonomous Organisation, the machine that eats the art world for lunch. So Sahel has just given us a kind of beautifully concentrated and kind of slightly discouraging kind of feeling of where the art world is at and kind of what's wrong with the system. I've been summarising the problem as the art world garners great wealth. Meanwhile, across the world's wealthiest cities, artists and art workers live in poverty and can barely scratch a living together. I'm repeating what Suhail said. This is a problem. And so I'm going to expand a little bit on this. And I'm going to talk about how the artists that we've worked with and the practice that I'm a part of, which has been really formed by our experience of life after the internet. So it's about life after network cultures, after network media, after network infrastructures, like what it means to be an artist after this time, and how artists working in these spaces are tackling this question, both on a kind of metaphorical level, as a way to understand what life is these days, but also kind of thinking critically about the systems of life and the art world. I'm going to introduce you very briefly to Furtherfield. Here's some figures. I'm not going to read them to you. It's just good to give you a sense of the kind of some orientation. So I am going to tell you how we got started. So I trained as a sculptor, and then in the mid-90s, I'd been part of a number of studio groups that had taken over old light industrial workspaces, turned them into studios, and it started to, I really started to think about where my sculptures might go. My studio was filling up, and all of the options for where my art might go made absolutely no sense to me. I didn't like the economies, I didn't like the spaces. What the work was about suddenly meant nothing when in any of the places where it might end up. And at the same time, I met Mark Garrett, who is my founding partner of Furtherfield. He'd had a long involvement with bulletin boards, pirate radio, a kind of street art milieu in Bristol, which I think gave us Banksy and some early net art activism from Irrational, Heath Bunting, Rachel Baker, these guys. And so London, two things were happening. The Saatchis were kind of like boosting the Brit art scene. This really changed what it felt like to be a contemporary artist in London. It went from a sense of kind of communal possibility on the one hand to being in competition with each other, setting up a star system that was supported by every layer of the establishment as far as I could tell. And of course Saatchi was he'd been the director of the PR company that had put Margaret Thatcher in power, which didn't warm him to me. And this was kind of somehow a kind of communication of what the art world should be now. At the same time, I experienced my first kind of real experience of the web. So this is 1996. It's not the super early days, but we have the web as a place where people are building their own homepages and posting pictures of their kittens. Corporate websites are essentially print brochures with an email contact address on them. An awful lot of pornography. And some artists kind of like building the structures that they need to engage people in very particular ways, in odd places in the world, and kind of understanding at that stage, we started to understand quite early that by working with techies and activists, we could start to create the kind of platforms that we needed to make the art context that we wanted. So 96, 97, we started making things that blogs before blogs were a thing. It was then possible to make web pages and put them up onto a server without having a lot of complex technical knowledge. And this is how Furtherfield got going. We were posting work that we thought was interesting that dealt with social and political issues that were somehow being smothered in the Brit art scene as we felt it, and found ourselves in connection with a lot of early people with a similar kind of drive around the world. I'm going to skip 10 years. 2006, we coined the term DAO. This stood for Do It With Others. We coined it as an open call for an email art exhibition, which I'm not going to talk about. The thing that I want to say about DAO was that it was this idea of moving on from the kind of the idea of the individual artistic genius, and a kind of communication of our understanding that a networked way of working really lent to a kind of much more ecological sense of what it is to make an artwork or to have an artistic practice. And also that we're always just contributing to a whole. So here, this is some kind of formulation of the web as a decentralized network, and we have the insects, the philosopher, the open source software license, the storage, the security issues, the talking dildo, the grassroots. Sorry, there's some really horrible metaphors in there. We made it quite a long time ago. But this idea that everything is kind of cross-category, and that when these things come together, you get new meanings springing up. Like, it's really a very unruly space. It's ironic that we kind of coined this in 2006, just as the web was like properly re-centralizing. So this was when Google, Amazon, Facebook, all of these things were starting. We were seeing a real re-centralization of power. And which is what's going to bring me to the main kind of what we're going to talk about. But I think it's worth just saying kind of that this kind of network thinking and ecological thinking, a thinking across difference and distance, has kind of means that this is now, this is kind of really shaped what it is that we do and how we approach it. So a kind of playful, collaborative art and research experience is core, always working with emerging network cultures. It's just what we do. It isn't the only important thing in the world, but it is what we've kind of found ourselves preoccupied with and kind of working on. We promote co-creational models. I'll talk about why that's important in a minute, but with a kind of strong focus on disrupting hegemony. I'll explain why again in a minute. We commission and exhibit artworks that engage critically with how technology is shaping the kind of urgent debates of our time. So technology obviously is kind of like the bleeding edge of capitalism, and it's often cloaked to make us feel super safe and comfortable. Our role is to kind of remove that cloak and help people feel very estranged from these devices to really understand how these things are not necessarily all working in our interest, but in a playful way. So that people are, it really is about giving people a way to kind of understand how these things are kind of forming and shaping our lives and our communities. And I guess this has been really core to our approach all along. So we grew up with techies who worked with free and open source software and approaches and philosophies with a focus on commons culture. And this is kind of, the commons culture kind of feeds into everything, and it's feeding forward as well. So what's important about commons culture is that the people who are making or stewarding the resources are also the people who benefit from it, and they're also the people who decide how things should be managed. And this is, it's kind of like in opposition to more extractive models of economy and more top-down models of governance. One of the problems that I have is that I kind of feel like I can really talk to you about anything, and therefore I'm going to go too wide. So we'll go wide in questions and answers, but I will try and keep focused. Okay, this is the last bit of context. We have a gallery in the heart of Finsbury Park. We've been there since 2011. The park is used by people who speak 180 different languages. We make it our business and it really is the kind of one of the most exciting things about working in this space. It's like aiming to make work that is relevant to anyone who comes through the door. It also means that we end up with a really broad audience of people who regard themselves as art enthusiasts, but also people who don't really care about art, but are happy to be addressed on topics that are relevant to their life. So this feels like a really great mix for us. We have a commons space down in the corner of the park where we run events and workshops and stuff. And the website, which is our kind of longest running platform, which is for critical review, debate, and sometimes we commission work as well. And then we've been we've been going a long time, so we now are working a lot in partnership with people in all different kinds of places. Okay, so, I'm missing an image there, I don't know how that happened. The thing I wanted to say, so I'm going to focus the second part of this talk, so this is the real kind of focus of the talk, is on the move from the web, of at least a part of our focus, from the web to the blockchain. Can I just have an indication? Could you raise your hands? I'm not going to ask you to do it, so it's safe. Could you raise your hands if you'd feel reasonably confident describing what the blockchain or Bitcoin was to somebody in your family? Just so I know who I've got in the room. Okay. So you can shout at me later if I say things that kind of feel wrong. The thing I wanted to say is that this diagram here was the diagram that really kind of most shaped our thinking about what the web did to a previously very centralised culture. So okay, because I'm talking to you about what I thought, it doesn't have to be true, it just happens to be real to me. So this diagram was made by Paul Baran for telecoms in the States, and it was about how to make robust and fast communications infrastructure that would survive hostile attack. And this kind of first network diagram was this idea of having broadcast from the centre. And in my mind, this kind of mapped onto 1950s BBC with someone very authoritative speaking from the centre while we all sat on our sofas going, yes, isn't that true? To a decentralised and distributed model. So the decentralised model allows us to leap across distance, And the distributed model is very resilient because you can take nodes out and the message can route around. And the web and the internet, so the internet being the infrastructure that sits under the software that runs the web, they're some combination of the decentralized and distributed networks which give us resilience and distance travelling. We've all got really blasé about what the internet and the web do. It's kind of extraordinary, I think, the transformation we're looking at in speed of communications, speed of knowledge building. I thought that it would be revolutionary in terms of what it did to the evolution of cooperation between humans, and that is a source of great ongoing disappointment to me. I think we should all be very disappointed about that, but it feels so. The next part of this talk, you'll see that that's the bit that we're pushing on. It's kind of like how we make infrastructures for kind of more nuanced cooperation so we can see ourselves together, so we can understand the impact of what we do. The web, simple net art diagram from 1997, and this was made by MTAA, so New York Artistic Partnership, and here this diagram says the art happens here. So this is, it's a kind of play on the intermedia kind of concept of art proposed by Fluxus. It's like the art happens in relation between us, only it's a bit kind of waggish, so it's kind of saying it's happening between the computers, but there's people behind the computers. There's meant to be a picture of the gallery here. So this is the diagram, this is the art diagram that underpins the gallery. So this is like this kind of mass ecology of physical, digital, symbolic, metaphorical infrastructures all in a mess together. And here's the blockchain diagram. I'm going to talk about blockchain in a minute. But so here what we have is, this is made by Rob Myers, and here the art happens here. And this is a chain of blocks which roll out over time. So now the art is fixed in time, and it's also fixed somewhat in relation to the idea of an asset. And that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to do a short blockchain explainer. 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto was the pseudonymous writer of the Bitcoin white paper. I don't think we really know who that person was, or whether they were an individual or whether they were a collective. But they created a piece of software and an argument for a piece of software that said that we could have money without banks and money without governments. And so in 2008, the blockchain is a decentralized database, cryptographically secured by a network of computers that enables decentralized money. So imagine taking the database that the banks normally look after that tells us what money there is in the world and sharing this out now amongst a group of us and saying we're now going to do that and we're going to reward the people who secure this network with a coin, and this is what money will be from now on. So you can kind of start. It's really boring to think about on the one hand, but on the other hand, just thinking about taking money out of the hands of governments and out of the hands of banks, you can start to see how this has a kind of potentially a strong kind of political opportunity at its heart. So we're talking about the first innovation of the blockchain as the disintermediation of authority through the issuance of a functional currency in the form of Bitcoin, and a decentralized bank in code backed by mathematics. Not only that, but the software can be infinitely reproduced, so you can have as many currencies backed by this decentralized network of computers run by humans. Someone I know is going to say, yeah, but Bitcoin isn't really decentralized, is it? And they're absolutely right. There's a ton of stuff around Bitcoin and blockchain where there's all this hype, and it's just packed full of problems that really need constant, like you need to really hold it to the flame and say, does it do what it says on the tin? And very often it doesn't. 2013, second wave blockchain is a decentralized database cryptographically secured by a network of computers that enables decentralized applications. So before it enabled decentralized money, now it's enabling decentralized applications. This was the brainchild of Vitalik Buterin of Ethereum, who invented Ethereum. And this enabled smart contracts. So these are pieces of code that sit in this decentralized network and that have wallets in their pocket. So we can think of, if we now think of a computer virus on the web, but we can now think of these smart contracts are actually enabling the software to move money, digital assets around. And this is where we get to the kind of autonomous bit of the decentralized autonomous organisation. So you can now start to imagine, you set a rule, so you say, I'm not going to be able to think of an example now. You say, if somebody performs these 5 tasks and they can prove it, then when those 5 tasks are done, the money will go into their account. The software does it, and you've suddenly removed the human element of the proof of the work being done. This is what the smart contract does. It enables people to automate the payment on the performance of a certain task or on the proof of a certain state of affairs being true. And one of the side effects of this is that it's encouraged engineers and others to imagine that all societal problems could be solved through the blockchain using smart contracts by by basically a process of incentivization. So at the kind of core of the second wave blockchain culture is this idea that people only do things for incentives and rewards, and that people only do things really for financial incentives and rewards, which is bizarre, but it's really it's very, very bedded into the culture of second wave blockchain. And it's been a source of preoccupation and fascination for me actually for the last 5 or 6 years as to how this culture is playing out and what the opportunities are for us to work with that. When we started working with the blockchain, the total market capitalization, so this is back in mid-July 2016, the total market capitalization was kind of approaching 0. And then you can see what happened here. So these coins that are being produced in the networks so it's kind of like, we've decided to make money. Now the money is worth something because people are buying it with fiat currency. And this is what happens to the value. So, when did I make this? So in April, the total market capitalization of all the different cryptocurrencies were at $250 billion. So I put this in here because we have on the one hand people talking about politics and changing the world and liberating themselves from banks and governments. On the other hand, we have another group of people saying we're going to save the world by liberating ourselves from corrupt banks, governments and institutions and moving everything into an automated system because machines are incorruptible. And yet, at the same time, in this layer over the top, you've got people speculating on the cryptocurrencies that are produced. So you've got this kind of double layer, which I found absolutely fascinating. It's this kind of the speculative layer where people are trying to make money out of things at the same time as people are talking about world change. It's fascinating. Okay, so to come back to the art, so I don't need to spend too long on this because Hale really kind of talked about it brilliantly. This is a guide to the market oligopoly system here by William Poida. Just go and look at it. It's a really great kind of analysis of how we are all enslaved with the masses at the bottom here, barely able to make a living. And at the top, the stars that we all look to, this is where we're all meant to kind of be aiming for. And so this is, when we started working with blockchain, this was kind of our analysis of what the problem was. So there's an awkward relationship between the value of arts to society and the way it's resourced and funded. So from funding, we have public, corporate and private. And while the value of it is social, economic, innate and core, it would be nice to have a whole conversation actually about what the potential value and values of art are, but maybe another time. We have, as we've said, this growing inability of artists and of the arts economies to support, like actually most living artists, to thrive. Increasing centralisation and homogeneity, so we have this kind of flattening out of meaning. The market and star systems inhibit and warp critical and political practice in all kinds of ways that are really kind of painful for everyone working in the system. And arts as a vehicle for speculation and money laundering. I wasn't kind of, until I started working, like really looking at this was not an area that I knew very much about, but it's huge. This is what the arts market says the blockchain can solve. So because the blockchain does a number of things, kind of technical things. So it says it's very good for tracking things. It proves that something happened. So because it produces these coins on a regular basis, oh dear, I've just realised I didn't do a bit of technical description here now. I'm going to do a tiny little bit more. So because the blockchain is like a timestamp, so it produces a set of records that are recorded on a ledger, and every 10 minutes, let's say, it's different for each currency according to different rules, but say every 10 minutes, it produces a coin because someone has secured, they've said, yes, these things belong in this ledger, and the whole network says it's true. So basically, it's a way of kind of coming to consensus about what is true. Now, because of that, it lends itself to authenticating that something has happened. So a whole kind of Artworld blockchain business has sprung up around title, provenance and authenticity, saying this thing exists and that it belongs to who it belongs to. Then, attached to that, we have securitization, insurance and lending. So here we have classic Artworld as art as financial widget, basically. We have some interesting things around selling tokens, which we're going to come back to. Auctions, marketplaces, and then there's working content and education. So, in my view, none of this stuff, except maybe the content and education stuff, is solving the problem. It's actually probably contributing to the problem. It's more of the same. It's more art as commodity, art as financialisation. Let's just kind of push it further. Fewer people having it. They all want it because it's going to raise in value. So a kind of speculative approach to art. The blockchain and arts together. So the promise of the blockchain and arts together is that we might get new funding models. And through the new funding models, we get a renegotiation of the economic and social value of art. So remember, I do have utopian tendencies, but I still think that this is worth pushing on. There's also the lowering the cost for organising. So DAOs, which I'm going to talk about in the last section of this talk, could remodel and diversify collaboration. So we have the idea that organisations can be built on the blockchain and that you can template them. And if you can template them, then they're cheaper to set up for other people. So you can imagine people templating artists' organisations, or imagine it as an artist manifesto, manifested as a piece of software that people can then take and repeat in different places. So we might be able to template a new kind of solidarity for artists and new kinds of audiences and patrons. we're seeing the emergent models of hybrid support, and these are some of the artists who are working in the field, who are doing really kind of interesting things which change the relationship between the artist, the audience, the patron and the collector. I'm going to talk about two examples. Okay, so we have Plantoid here by Chaos and Primavera de Felipe. This is an android plant that dances and glows when you tip it with Bitcoin or Ethereum. And it has a little counter, and as it is, so it's collecting money, it's collecting tips essentially. And once it reaches a certain level, it commissions artists to make its babies. There are now 16 of these in the art world. So it's this idea of a kind of self-replicating art piece, but also she talks about it as an evolution of a new life form. What's interesting about listening to Primavera talk about this work is that at the heart, so this has a kind of physical body, but at its heart is its governance, which is written into a smart contract. So when you tip it, you also get to say the terms upon which the next one will exist. So there are charitable plantoids now. So you can say, I want the baby of this one to donate half of its money to such and such a charity. I don't know whether we have any cooperative plantoids at the moment, but it's this idea that you can be part of the evolution of new governance systems that sit in the heart of an artwork. I think is really intriguing. It's a very clever work. And the Jonas Lund token, Jonas Lund has made a large portion of the body of his practice. He sold tokens as shares, and so you can get a share in his work if you support his practice in some way, and you will get some return on that share. So it's this kind of idea of having shares in an artistic practice. The Jonas's work is really deep, and I strongly recommend you go and have a look at what he's doing, because he's, in creating these shares, he's really creating a kind of nuanced relationship between artists, collectors and audiences in a very interesting way. And I guess from the flip side of this, a very important part of artists' role working in the blockchain space is to open up these technologies. The blockchain is like incredibly kind of masked, full of mystique. There's an awful lot of vaporware, so endless marketing campaigns for things that will never exist, that are there just to attract investment and money. And so the artists have a role in really looking at what this stuff does, how it might change what happens next, and ensuring that the technology itself gets to be shaped by people from a more diverse background. Oh, thank you. So, the promise of DAOs. These decentralized autonomous organisations, so we can just think of them as cooperatives. I'm going to read this out because I found it helpful. They allow people to exchange economic value, to pool resources and form joint ventures without control from the centre, in ways that were impossible before blockchains, to agree on how risks and rewards should be distributed, and to enjoy the benefits or otherwise of shared activities in the future. These are legal contracts as free software. We've got this idea of templating organisation, so it's free for anyone to set up. We have organisational design free from judicial systems. I've been told off for saying this, but it's kind of true at the moment because no one knows what you're doing. I mean, the law can't keep up with what's happening in this space. And the idea of autonomous, ownerless organisations. Of course, this is a total fiction, but because the systems are made by humans to work in the interest of the people who made them. But nevertheless, there's something in the space between the fiction and the reality that does give us, it gives us some room to think differently, I think. And we could have members of organisations. So you can imagine members of organisations, some of the members might themselves be machines or they might themselves be DAOs. So this gets very complex very quickly. So this is just a timeline of our work with blockchain. Back in 2004, Rob Myers, who made that diagram, you will remember, of the blockchain, art happens here in the blockchain. He wrote a paper called DAO It with Others, and this was it was a provocation for us to move on from DAO to DAO, and it was unintuitive. It got us into a lot of trouble with our community, and I think it's worth just spending a moment on this because there's a strong pull in the web, in artists working in the early days of the web, that it stayed free, and free meant cost-free, not just free as in freedom. Because there was this idea that then equated to access, and that it was more inclusive. Now, one of the problems with this, and what's interesting in thinking about the blockchain space, is that you're now talking about a network in which it has money baked in. Every exchange is there's a question about its value and its price. And this seemed worth looking at. So the idea of putting DAO into a space that is where you're thinking about transactions and transactionalism felt important at a time of ecological collapse. Like, we cannot imagine that we are just living in endless abundance. We cannot imagine that artists can live off air and nothing else to produce the value that they produce. He did that. He spawned a ton of exhibitions, films, really made us think about a lot of things, including this book. It's really good, you should get it. It has documents of artworks in it. It has fictions about how the world is different if people are thinking in this way. And it has some theory, both about the art world and blockchain more widely in society. We've run a set of events called the DAO Lab and Debate Series to bring people from across different settings and backgrounds and specialisations to really think about the infrastructure that we're creating. And these are some of the kind of core questions that we've looked at, like how cultural organisation happens, what it really means to do good, because there's obviously you have the kind of marketing wing, everyone's telling you that they're doing good, but to really think about how we might accidentally do really horrible things is really important. And the question of identity and identification. Can I have 7 minutes? Okay, I'm going to take 7 minutes. And I'm going to show you, we've been using a whole series of different kind of artistic formats and methods to bring people together and think about this difficult stuff. And I'm going to play you, I'm going to play you some minutes. So this is from a live action role play that we ran called What Will It Be Like When We Buy an Island on the Blockchain? Okay, I'm just going to play it.
Sovereignty of the island doesn't account to like America or Puerto Rico or anything land-based, because of the infrastructure in terms of the internet which is provided. Basically, we have allegiance to the big corporations that provide that have sort of sponsored us and traditionally kind of provided that infrastructure. So yeah, it's a kind of different kind of sovereignty, I suppose.
Okay, and I understand you're responsible for the head of education stuff.
Yeah.
Could you tell me what your role is?
Well, when all the children come to school on their first day, they're chipped. So it actually removes all their kind of memory and, you know, any experiences that they've had up until that age. And then, but we have been discussing the problems because there is one child that refuses, that we just have been unable to kind of, you know, chip, so it's been quite difficult. The kids learn on their own. We don't educate as such. There's no kind of dynamic between the teacher and the children. And they're very advanced, actually. They understand networks, and they're just able to learn a lot quicker. And we found that it's much more beneficial to allow them to do that amongst themselves, rather than us try and kind of shape what is going on. And what they do is they enter into some of the rituals in society where you know, they have the opportunity to vote on a daily basis, and also we've got a structure where they gain points from like their behaviour, basically, and it's about their ability to kind of like coexist in a harmonious way with everybody else. And so they sort of realise quite quickly, I guess, that, you know, if they behave in certain ways and are, like, you know, for the good of the rest of the society, then they gain these kind of like this currency, basically. So yeah, it's kind of quite a sort of child-led, with certain things in place, and then they just learn.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So I wanted to show you that because I kind of want to show you two ends of the work. So one end of the work is kind of like, is trying to get a sense of where the world is going, where these networked worlds are going, for better or for worse, and using speculation and fiction. So this Helen Knowles is an artist who took part in the LARP that we ran. She was there for 3 hours just as a participant, and was able to kind of put herself into this very strange model of mind, which is certainly no stranger than actually a lot of the things that are discussed at many blockchain conferences, and into a kind of sense of a kind of ideological extremism based around decentralized ideas. So we have this on the one hand, and then I'm just going to finish up by talking about the Artworld DAO think tank. So this is a 52-hour immersive event that I've developed with artist Penny Rafferty, who does a lot of work with kind of participatory immersive practices. And it's combining these kind of uncanny working methods, a lot of body work, alongside technology, a kind of technical and political discussion, and bringing people together across disciplines to think both from a very kind of fictional, artistic, speculative level, but also we've been working to make prototypes for new kinds of arts organisation. I'm very happy actually to share these slides. I just thought I'd show you the schedule. This is a schedule, and if you look at the schedule, it's a kind of mix of, it's this mix of very utilitarian work and then work that is being done both on an interior individual basis and on a collective basis to try and access and get in touch with the different parts of ourselves, and to do this work with real care and trying to, as a way to understand what the impact of the work might be. Our expert speakers came from quite kind of different parts of the arts and blockchain ecosystem. So we have the Ingrid Lafleur, who stood for Afrofuturist Mayor and is head of Decentralised Detroit in Detroit. We have Colony, who are one of the earliest blockchain organisational companies. Lisa Solsken of Wage in New York, who's kind of a lot about kind of, I guess we could think of it as an artist union, although that isn't how she likes to think about it, but as a kind of way to put pressure on institutional reputation. And Matt Liston, who was a very early blockchain entrepreneur, who then moved into art and made a religion on blockchain as art. That's his claim. I don't endorse it. And we ended by prototyping. So together we were prototyping what potential DAOs might be. I think I've talked enough. I'm just gonna. I don't think I should enumerate these things, but you can ask me about them. Maybe I'll leave that set of questions up, and we can discuss it further.
Overview of a number of quite complicated things.
Yes.
I don't think we can get into too much technical detail. But I've got, as usual, two fairly, one longish question, one short one. In the slide, as you went from the kind of business as usual adaptation of blockchains, so you had the slides around securitization, and you called it artwork as financial widget.
Yeah.
So there's a way in which the commercial part of the art system, which is the power part of the art system, is kind of very interested in blockchains as a way to track them, and a way to kind of automate the trading, or kind of secure the trading mechanisms. You then kind of went from that slide to the alternative that you were presenting, in which you said there were other ways in which the blockchain technology could be used to decentralize distribution. And I just wondered around that a little bit, if you could elaborate, because it seemed to me that two things were introduced at that point, which kind of continue through the talk. One is that the model of the blockchain is necessarily financial, but you seem to be suggesting that there were other possibilities as well. So, for example, when you say, the command code for saying that this is verified as part of the blockchain, as these 5 things need to be done, and then you get a coin. Mm. It could be these 5 things are done, and then, like with Ecosia, a tree is planted somewhere to help, kind of deal with climate chaos and the rest of it. So there are all kinds of other incentives or rewards that could be put in place which aren't financial, but nonetheless the blockchain is still an asset, right? So I think it was just to kind of amplify whether the kind of incentive structure of the blockchain has to be financial. It seems to me not necessarily, but also whether you're kind of committed to an asset model if you're operating on a blockchain.
Okay. Your first point is correct. It doesn't have to be financial. There is this kind of question of provability. So if you can't prove that something has happened, then it probably doesn't belong on a blockchain. So you need. So there's a lot of work being done around oracles. There's a lot of work. So an oracle is the system whereby a network of computers can come to a consensus that something has happened without one human being saying, yes, this has happened. So there was some really interesting work done by an artist group called Terra Zero, who set a bunch of cameras on a bunch of, I want to say tulips. Was it tulips? It was tulips. Someone's nodding. Hooray! And each flower was tokenized, so you could buy the flower and get a token for your flower, and then depending on whether the flower wilted and died or bloomed and kind of sprang into life, your token would go up or down. Mm-hmm. And the oracle in this case was a camera or a set of cameras and some sensors that were testing how well the plant was doing. So some of the more interesting work in relation to blockchain and ecology are around these kind of oracles that are drawing on scientific sensing data and then possibly making either financial or agricultural decisions based on what those sensors return.
And presumably with Internet of Things,
Yes.
which allows ubiquitous surveillance
Yes.
or ubiquitous sensing,
Yes.
you can tokenize anything at all
Yes.
and automate kind of processes in any direction that the token sort of pushes you
Yes.
towards. So you could use this quite, and I think there are models of this where you can sort of automate the construction of an ecosystem to become more powerful as a carbon extractor.
Yes. I'm very happy for someone to disagree with me. One of the things that seems endlessly to be the case, however, is that the technological infrastructure is never anywhere near as developed and sophisticated as the ideas are. So the blockchain infrastructure is still really not anywhere near that kind of level
That's
of
why we
being
do
able
art,
to deliver
right?
it, which is why we do art, yes.
Yeah, because that's where we do the ideas,
Yeah.
right?
It's why we need to get in now, actually. You know, like why we need to keep hacking away at this so that we can get a lot of the really terrible ideas out of our system.
How do we get in?
How do we get into what?
Well, you said we need to get in. Like we need to get into the blockchain world.
I
right?
mean, we need to familiarise ourselves with the concepts and tools that are being built.
Right.
And insert ourselves in very annoying ways into the conversations that are happening at conferences and where the money is.
And you think that can happen? Like that's likely, as opposed to just like a pipe dream that, you know, artists do things, but it's kind of fairly interesting but peripheral.
Well, I mean, you could say that about an awful lot of things that people are doing on the blockchain as well. Like,
Right.
Is it all a pipe dream? The levels of kind of smoke and mirrors are really high in this space. And we shouldn't underestimate the power of artists to actually be able to manifest things, I think.
Because it's so speculative.
Because artists are really scrappy and they know how to get things done, I think. Sometimes. Some of us are.
So just.
I mean, the three prototype DAOs that I just showed, these are three things that are actually being built, that are going to be used, that are going to be tested, and they're being tested with a community, which is another kind of one of the really tricky problems for the blockchain developer community, is that it's a kind of real bubble, and their idea of a user is another blockchain developer. So with artists, this is why this feels like a really interesting time for artists to be working with DAOs, is because artists, it's like in the early days of the web, artists, they're quite driven to engage with people outside of their own circles and to test things and to do the kind of community building. So that it means we actually get to stress test some stuff.
It might be instructive if you could outline one of the DAOs that you spoke about.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the end.
Yeah. So Black Swan is the DAO that's being built by Penny Rafferty and a bunch of people in Berlin. As I understand it, it's a system by which they are, I'm on video, I'm going to say it anyway, they're kind of blackmailing the Berlin arts institutions into giving money to the artists, local artist communities, and not just money but resources, space, and some kind of critical space in return for the artists actually creating a more lively space on the ground. So it's a way, the DAO is going to be a way for managing institutions to put money into community art spaces, and for that to be done in a transparent way so they can start to track the impact of their benevolence into the... like you could say in London that, okay, we have Tate Exchange, but really for them to earn their keep in the London art world, should they not actually be putting more money into artist studios or artist communities on the ground? And that's what Black Swan's there to do.
Right, so you can actually sort of track where the money is going,
Yeah.
how it's being used and so on and so forth, and that's publicly accessible
Yes.
by everyone on the blockchain.
Yes.
And you can report that externally.
Yes.
And it's also an automated tracking, so you don't need somebody to kind of check things
That's
off
right.
on an
That's
order.
right.
Right. So
An artist friend of mine, Lara Blaschick, has come up with a really gorgeous term which I really like, which is armchair auditors.
right.
So it turns the kind of art world community into armchair auditors. So it's a kind of doing just doing a proper audit of what the responsibility should be
Right.
for
So
the
it's
centralised organisation.
Accountability from
Yeah.
below. Well, this kind of comes to the second question I was going to ask, which was around interpretation. So like the standard model, certainly the one that we apply on the fine art program here, is that the artwork is made for interpretation by a human interpreter. So you put the artwork up, someone says, I think it means this, somebody else says, I think it means that, you have a dispute, you do a kind of Rancierian democracy moment, and that's the best result you can get from an artwork. But, sorry, paraphrasing a quite complicated set of operations. But it seems to me like the model of the blockchain just doesn't allow for interpretation. If you have a scheme where you have to do these 5 or X number of things and then it gets registered on the blockchain, there's zero interpretive space there, right? And I'm interested in it partly because one of the challenges around a kind of series of talks on systemics is to get away from, as I was saying in the introduction, a kind of limited sense of effectivity where the artwork puts forward an option or like a possibility. And then what happens to that possibility is entirely up to the fate of how it's encountered, whether people want to take it up. But we know, in fact, there are very few artworks that do anything beyond exist in the exhibition and interpretation system. So it seems that maybe if we kind of transpose the operational model to something more like a blockchain or a DAO, one of the things that we'd have to move away from is the notion of the artwork as being set up for interpretation, or interpretation being the kind of correct destination in a way for what the artwork should be doing. It would be much more about how can it contribute to or be checked off in a blockchain structure.
That isn't how I think about it at all. Okay, so
so I mean that became a bit of a thesis, but more what happens to interpretation then, which is I think still the received model of like conventional business as usual artwork.
So this is the world of blockchain. This is the bit of blockchain world that I think is interesting, and there's room to do something interesting artistically in it. I understand what you're saying, but as with all technologies, people will find a way to do interpretation. They just won't do it on the blockchain. So the interpretation will still happen around an artwork.
Sure.
Yeah. From DIWO to DAO, I guess our thesis is that for us, the most interesting art practice is to build new art worlds, to build new art contexts. So any artwork you build, you are always building it in relation to a community of other practitioners, thinkers, audience members who may turn into practitioners. So there isn't this, I guess it's just that the artwork is always much more mobile, and always much more mobile and in relation to a kind of community. And the kind of blockchain community space that we're interested in are things that have a kind of more commons basis where there is more communal decision making going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Questions? There's one over there. Thank you. Are there any more from that? Okay, there's 2. Any more from? We'll take these 2 and then come to you.
Thanks for that. I'm really tired, so I'm probably going to have trouble formulating this question. So I'm also really interested in the commons as this model for kind of general social organization, administration, and so on. But increasingly, I've also been thinking about art and making art as a kind of and the possibility for innovation within art as something that requires, in some sense, a kind of a willingness to go beyond the kind of dialectic of expectation and disappointment, or in other words, to present people with something that in some sense disappoints them, or isn't quite what they've asked for, or is in some sense not living up to an expectation of what it can be, and only under those circumstances can art in some sense be new. Within this model of the commons, and this is not really looking at the technical side, but I thought it was brilliant what you spoke about today, but this doesn't really go into that to such a degree. But I'm curious about how you think it might play out in a system in which the production and the support of art has become democratized in a way where people feel very individually kind of invested in that way in which that system that produces the art, how it might go, or what might happen in a situation in which that trust is somewhat betrayed, or in which artists have to act subversively within this kind of system that is supporting art, that is based on this kind of mutual relation of like almost kind of solidarity or production through the commons. Is that clear in some way? I'm not sure.
I need you to say just a little bit more. So you're saying, I think you were saying something might go wrong if we have a commons model for artistic production.
Not so much that. I think it would be a great model. I'm more kind of, it's not even a question I expect like a definitive answer to, but it's maybe just the kind of thing that, how would you, have you had any thoughts about this, or does it present to you like an interesting problem that in some sense what art must do at times is not produce something that was being asked for, but produce something that it kind of almost, it seems like it's like
Are you saying that some of the best art is unwanted, disliked, and
disappointing?
Disappointing.
Not even that, but it's not even like it might be untimely, if you get what I mean, or it might not be. Yeah, right. I'm sorry.
I'm going to paraphrase, if I may. This may not be the question you're asking, but I'm going to turn into one that maybe Ruth can answer. So I think, as I understand it, the kind of construction of a commons presumes community and communication and people kind of working together towards something. But there is a model of art which I think you could describe to someone like Adorno, in which the artwork is political when it doesn't do good communication, when it's not functioning in a kind of coherent and sort of expected manner. So what space is there for that kind of artistic model, which I think is a standard critical model, against the kind of commons production model? That may not be what you're asking. Great. Okay, good.
Thank you. I just think we're so many millions of miles away from having that situation embedded enough for it to become a problem. I think it's kind of like we're pushing towards it. I'd be really fascinated to see what happens. I think there's who knows what will happen. I want to see it. I want to live that question.
You mean the commons model?
The commons, yeah. Like what happens? Like how do we kind of keep pushing at the edges of things? Because those are the kind of questions that I think artists want to be asking. It's just that we never get to ask those questions because we're kind of jammed in a really boring box a lot of the time.
The white cube.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. My question is about how this seems to me to be very different than the traditional subculture or alternative model that is based on a kind of a rejection of a system rather than coming up with a self-sustainable system of its own. Because to me it feels for so long not having any talk of money involved was such a big way to define a certain kind of freedom. But then, of course, everyone was starving and it got really difficult to sustain an art world. Whereas this feels to me like the opposite of trying to not reject something but constitute a system, a different kind of system of value. Because it also kept coming up a lot, this question of value, last year as well in these lectures, and it was like when you reject monetary value as a certain form of value and you're really confused about what to put in its place, it's either a complete disagreement, which is not very self-sustainable for building communication or solidarity, or it's a self-validating system of, I don't know, criticality or something, but there are all these self-validating systems. So not rejecting this kind of monetary value, but having something self-sustainable instead of it that nonetheless is based on ideas of value and consensus rather than disagreement. Or, I mean, it feels like such a shift from the traditional model of how to do something alternative, how to do something subcultural. So perhaps you could talk a bit about that, because that feels very interesting.
Okay, so there's two things I think that I'd like to pick up on there. One is this idea of like creating a positive, self-sustaining community or new value system or new value flows. I just think we have to really be kind of seeking out new ways of doing things. We're coming right up to the edge of the waterfall. You know, it's like we can't just put ourselves in a space where we're just critiquing the waterfall all the time. We have to kind of be really thinking about what we might do on the one hand, and then on the other, I kind of have a self-critique of at least the first kind of 10 years of my practice on the web, when basically I found the idea of money or the idea of capital so distasteful, and it was just about possible to make some kind of living without thinking about it, because we had a little bit of kind of air in the social welfare system, or I could get housing benefit, or there were things that made it possible to make some kind of living. The problem with that was that it was possible for me to do that because I had some resilience in my social networks because of my class, but there were a whole load of people who were excluded from being able to make those kind of choices. And I think that's become really exacerbated over the last 10 years. So I think it's like we don't have this, we can't imagine anymore that there is an art world that isn't shaped by our relationship with money and capital. We just have to look at it. And it's really interesting as well, because like what's going on in the world is so shaped by what's going on in the world of finance that's really hard to understand. It's deliberately obscure in order that certain things can go on that maybe aren't in they are not in all of our interests. They're not in the majority of our interests. So there's also this kind of additional effect of value of artists actually taking a hard look at economic systems and finance and taking it as their medium, because we need more people to understand what's going on. So I think it's a kind of double thing. We need things that will operate a different set of values, and we need more people to be bringing that critical eye to what's happening in the financial and money systems.
Hi, thanks for the talk. This is a two-part question, and maybe it's possible I just don't understand the models you're presenting, but the first one is sort of a, I guess, utopian or dystopian question. Do you think that generally, if we lived in a world where there were more alternative currencies, wouldn't we sort of subvert the state's power to redistribute and perform fiscal policy interventions during a recession, which would like sort of reinforce pro-cyclical recessions? And then second, on the more local scale, isn't it sort of a way to encourage more offshore tax avoidance in the art world?
What is the it?
Sorry?
You said isn't it?
Isn't alternative currency and blockchain a way for galleries to further avoid taxes by making their money easier to hide offshore and subject to, let's say, capital gains taxes rather than income tax?
So the second part of that question is, they're both really good questions. I have no idea what the answer is to the first question. The second question's a really interesting question, because a whole load of kind of blockchain hype has been around transparency and how we'll all, but of course it's like really simple. You just don't put your stuff on a public blockchain, or you use blockchain for the marketing bits and then you hide everything else. I mean, it's already really easy for people to hide and to avoid taxation. It's not, there are already a cajillion ways for people to do that. So I'm not so worried about that, because It's already a problem that's out of control, and blockchain may not make it any more easy. It's already very easy. I think maybe to your first question though, like if we have a multiple currency, then suddenly do we disempower the state from being able to weigh in and help install better social care and better social systems? I think that this is a political question before it's a technical question, probably. I think that our problems start more with we need to be having better political conversations and conversations about political organisation. And blockchains are pretty neutral, actually, I think. They can be used. It's just that they are shaped and built in the interest of the people who fund their building. This is the problem. So we actually need more diverse people giving their attention to it and shaping it in a way that is in more of our interest.
I would just add, I think the neutrality of money is sort of like the neoliberal dream, right? Having it as a stable current force, and this is sort of a way to reinforce that by divesting the state's power to print money. That's all.
Yeah.
Any more questions? There's one over there, towards the back. Can you put your hand up so Arrow can see?
Thank you for your talk. I'm really interested in the ideas. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about the idea of sustainability, because I'm really interested in the idea of these systems, but aren't they also built upon technologies that are very polluting and non-sustainable? And I was wondering if you might have ideas about how these kinds of systems might be, the technologies on which they're built might be created sustainably within a kind of commons culture.
Can I just can I borrow a mic? So just to amplify the question, because I think there was some assumptions in that which may need to be explained. So when you're kind of using stuff like this on a screen, it looks very low energy. There's a huge energy cost, of course, with the servers and the rest of it. And so there's an issue about, as we know, like with Bitcoin, the amount of energy that's consuming is now greater than whatever small country is next on the list. So there's a sense in which the more blockchain technologies are used, the more demand there'll be on energy and consumption costs, right?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. So I've heard a lot of people. I've heard people who I respect answer this question in many different ways. So one, a kind of technical response. So Bitcoin is one of the blockchain currencies, one of the blockchain platforms. It's very energy hungry. Many of the Bitcoin mining systems are set up around, in China actually, around hydropower systems. So so an argument, I don't know really how much I agree with this, but one argument is that they're using surplus energy. So yes, it uses a lot of electricity, but they're using up energy that isn't kind of necessarily polluting. One answer. Another answer is that many of the other blockchain systems are evolving new consensus mechanisms. So Bitcoin works by a system called proof of work, which is basically taking all the electrical energy usage as a way to secure the coin. So it can't be hacked because you'd have to pay too much for the electricity in order to hack it. But there are new systems like proof of stake. There's a number of new kind of consensus systems that don't use electricity. They use other kinds of systems which are not so energy hungry. So this is another answer to the question. And the other answer to the question, which sounds more controversial, but I think it's really interesting, is the kind of what if, or what about. So what about street lights? What about car production? What about the existing financial system? These are all ridiculously energy hungry and they maybe we should be asking the same questions about them.
Okay, one final question. Maybe just we'll use this mic to get the question. Just one final question over here.
I wanted to ask a question about the network effects dimension of this discussion. So network effects in general are very critical in this discussion. So usually when we talk about these blockchain Bitcoin projects, the initial founders of these systems, the authors of the protocols, the developer core community, are like defining rules, right? They are actually setting up the configuration of how these systems will work. And this is a lot of power, because they are the authors of the protocols that all people use or whatever the systems are using. And the second is like they distribute some initial amount of tokens or coins or money to some certain community around them, which are mostly investors and whoever was interested in the project early on, the early adapters or whatever we call it. So these two, qualities of these networks are usually defines the power from the very beginning, from the get-go, and this has been, a discussion here and there, sometimes in the communities of blockchains. But I'm wondering, in your DAO projects, what would be your strategies maybe for, access distribution? Let's say I'm not really talking about access distribution and to initial communities that you want to flourish, maybe. And what are your thoughts about it?
Well, what we're not doing is making a new currency for a start. For that very reason, that the currency productions are often working on a kind of Ponzi scheme basis, like kind of first in, and then you're always feeding money up to the first people into the system. I guess what we're looking at is producing experiments that will federate rather than all be flowing into the same system. So our kind of, I think of the 3 prototypes that I showed, these are all ideas for things that would act on a local level, be tested on a local level, and then could be shared and delivered in another space and tested in another space. So I'm imagining communities of knowledge and exchange where we're testing templates, but we're not necessarily looking at a kind of a single network with a powerful person in the centre of it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
It feels like a kind of pat answer, but I think it's the truth. Yeah, okay.
All right, so I think there's obviously a lot of complex and involved developments and details involved in this, and we're going up for a drink now.
Yeah.
So I guess if you have questions around that, Ruth can take them up there. It does seem to me, before we all start packing up, let me just kind of say give the valediction. It does seem to me that what you've presented is the start of something, not just an individual project, but where the technology is and where social organisation and reconfiguration is. And I think, as you said in an earlier response, it's a really good place for art to intervene if it's going to make the kind of critical and collective claims that we're doing. So I'm really glad that you came in at this point to contribute to the series. So that's the end of this first series. We'll see you again in 2 weeks at 7:30 to start the next one. And thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.